Dove was appointed by Librarian of Congress James Billington to serve as the 7th Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress. She is the youngest person ever to hold the position. Others carrying the title of laureate include Robert Penn Warren, Richard Wilbur, Howard Nemiroff, Mark Strand, Joseph Brodsky, and Miss Dove's immediate predecessor, Mona Van Dyne. The title, Poet Laureate, in some form or other dates back in time to William the Conqueror in 11th century England. Serving in the household of the king, the Poet Laureate was expected to write poetry in celebration of noteworthy public events. The office of Poet Laureate began with a pension and an allowance of wine granted to Ben Jonson by King James I in 1616. But John Dryden was considered to be the first person to officially bear the title of Poet Laureate under King Charles II. However, the more famous Alfred Lord Tennyson may be the most significant British poet to bear this distinction. The history of the laureateship at the Library of Congress began in 1936 with a chair originally titled Poetry Consultant, a position endowed by the late Archer M. Huntington. Joseph Auslander was the first incumbent. Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish later determined that the position should be filled on a rotating basis instead of life tenure like the English version. Some of the more famous poetry consultants at the Library of Congress include Robert Frost and James Dickey. In 1986, Congress officially changed the title of the poetry consultant to Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry. Rita Dove's academic career began in Akron, Ohio, where she was selected as a presidential scholar in 1970, signifying her as one of the top 100 high school graduates in that year. After having graduated from Miami University of Ohio, Rita Dove studied modern German at the University of Tübingen as a Fulbright Fellow. She then went on to earn a Master of Arts degree at the University of Iowa. This is where she met her husband-to-be, Fred Vebon, a novelist and playwright. The couple and their daughter, Aviva, live in Charlottesville, Virginia, where she teaches creative writing at the University of Virginia.
You're still 40 years old.
Interviewing Rita Dove in the poetry room of the Thomas Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress is National Public Radio special correspondent Susan Stamberg.
You're the first black poet laureate of the United States of America, the first black woman poet laureate of the United States of America. How's it going?
It's very busy. Let me say it's very busy, but I'm really thrilled about all the excitement and attention that poetry has been getting as a result. So I'm just going to ride the top of the wave as long as I can.
Good for you. You're not going to have to write formal poems of state the way they do in Britain.
No.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. I don't think that anything lasting comes out of that sort of thing. I mean, poetry really developed as a way of, in the community, someone who spoke for the group and did things at ceremonies and stuff like that. But we have different means of gathering our world community together, and you don't need me to write a poem about it necessarily.
And you're right, the definition has been pretty vague over the years. No state poems, but do arrange readings and encourage the library in its purchase of poetry.
Exactly, which often, you know, can have a resounding effect. I plan a literary season for the library, which has just started, and it's rolling really well.
You were number one.
I was number
right.
one, and then just, you know, the next we had another 2 poets come in, and it's going to be exciting. I have a few plans in store for the spring. I have to find a little bit more funding for them because I want to do a little bit more than just poetry readings. I want to combine poetry with jazz. I want to bring in a group of Indian children who have been writing poems for years, and we'll see what happens, but I'm excited.
A woman involved in meter, and I read somewhere you said once that poetry, the language of poetry was like a bouillon cube.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
It's so concentrated. It's hopefully language at, you know, at its best. And poetry, I think for me, the most beautiful poems in our language are those that use the words, absolutely essential words in what seems to be such an an efficient, that sounds cold, but in an efficient order that it practically takes our breath away because it seems to happen instantaneously. The revelation happens instantaneously. Like a bouillon cube, because it's also very practical. You can take a book of poems, you know, you can practically slip it in your pocket or just carry it along with you. And what's in it? It blooms, it unfolds. There are whole worlds in a poetry book.
And there's some nourishment there, too.
There is nourishment. There's a spiritual nourishment, you know. So it has all those aspects. And you don't even have to unwrap the foil wrapper.
I know you feel also that poetry is music and that it begins with music. Robert Frost said a poem, what did he say, begins with a lump in the throat?
Yes, yes.
That's probably true, too.
That's true, too. There are many truths. That's what's so lovely about this world.
But what about the music part of it?
Well, I think, well, poetry, it begins with music, it begins with breath. And I think that, well, poetry used to be wedded to music. I mean, the poet in the community, and I'm talking about prehistoric or societies, it was the person who, in fact, was responsible for the history of the tribe or the community. But it was often sung. It often was accompanied by drums or by some kind of music. So that linkage is a very early one. And when the printing press came in, we lost a little bit of that, because now we had to create the music in our head. There wasn't a sense of the whole group breathing together as they, you know, heard a poem or a recitation. So I think that poetry recovers for us a sense of language as sound, language as something that is pleasing, you know, when it comes over the tongue. And in that sense, it works on us not only in rational ways, but it works on us with, you know, orally. It also works us right, it gets us right here, right where we breathe, you know. So.
But also, you can get things said about a society.
Yeah.
You can do that in all kinds of poetry, but
right.
The rappers seem to be doing it in their way too, sometimes to very destructive and cruel ends.
Yes, and I don't really agree with the violence, the level of violence in rap. I mean, rap really comes from a very old oral tradition among African Americans, from signifying in toasts and dozens. And it served, actually, I think, a constructive purpose. You had to be a virtuoso in language to show that you were quick on your feet in situations. And that's part of what rap is about, too. The fact that you can quickly turn something into something pleasing to the ear and still get a message across. And that has something to do with street smarts, you know, and survival.
But you've said that poetry particularly was a form for people who've been shut out, for minorities, and for those who've been oppressed.
I think it's a form for everyone, but I do think that those who have been oppressed or shut out, that one recourse comes through expressing oneself through poetry. I also happen to think, and this may sound very highfalutin, but I think that poetry is our salvation in a way too, because we are in a country where it's really a mosaic. It's not a melting pot, it's a mosaic.
A few years ago, I talked to a predecessor of yours, probably in this room, Mark Strand. It was during the Gulf War, and he was getting poetry sent to him by soldiers who were serving over there.
Wow.
People who never read poetry, had never written poems before, but found in those circumstances, in the tension of those days, poetry became the form for them. And they would send the poems home to the parents, and the parents sent them here to the library. Isn't it?
And it's wonderful. I mean, it's incredible. I do think that in moments of extreme need, the human beings do turn to the arts. And it's a shame that sometimes it has to wait till then. But I have gotten, since, you know, taking office, I've gotten so many letters from people who have said, I write poetry, and it makes me, you know, makes me feel better. I show it to my friends. Incredible hunger for expressing things that matter to us, you know, and not finding any other means to do that but through the language itself. So I think that's fantastic.
It's fantastic, but it's also amazing you're getting letters like that, because poetry's scary, too. I mean, you know, as kids, we learn you have to really respect poetry, and it makes you nervous, and you think you have to be so smart to get it.
Yeah, I think that respect stuff has killed, more love of poetry. It's done more damage than anything. Poetry has two lives, and there is this scary part, this idea that, oh, poetry is something I can't understand, and a lot of times, unfortunately, that has come through being taught poetry at some point in the school system where a child feels that they have to get the right answer. You read this poem, and then they're going to have to talk about it afterwards. And if you really think about it, anything that matters deeply to us, it's almost impossible to paraphrase, right? It's almost impossible to describe it to someone else. I'm trying to combat that anxiety about poetry. I think if kids particularly are introduced to poetry in a completely non-threatening way when they're very young, say even in kindergarten, they get read a poem. Teacher says, we're going to have our poetry minute now, and she or he picks out a poem and reads it, and that's it. Just lets it float in the air for a while and then goes on to something else. They'll grow up with it, and it won't be something to be threatening. It's something that they can chew on.
Maybe the thing to do is assign them to write a poem. Just say you need to show something to your parents, write a poem. Start with 5 lines, take it home, show it to your mom and dad.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a great idea. I think when kids actually get their fingers in it, and they start writing themselves, even if they've had some negative experiences about poetry before that, they get really excited. And I think the best thing to do is to tell them to write it, but not give them any kind of assignment. Don't make it something that they feel they're going to get a grade on or not. When I was in 8th grade, I remember I had a teacher who did this wonderful thing, an English teacher. Once a week, she said it was our day to write or read, and we went into English class, and the only requirement was that we be quiet. We had to bring a book to read. There was no, if we wanted to talk to her, we could go up and talk to her, but there was no pressure. We didn't have to show her the writing. It was amazing. Everybody sat there and read and wrote. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to me.
What a great story. So this idea of getting poetry into the classrooms and then out of the classrooms, sort of through to the rest of us out there, to increase the audiences for it. You've had thoughts about getting it on television. You like MTV. So what do you think? Poetry, MTV?
Why not? I mean, I remember when MTV first came out, I would watch some of those early videos, which were absolutely remarkable. And I kept thinking, it's poetry, it's poetry. Not only for the words of the songs, but actually the visual images, which were sometimes, they would transform themselves, and there's some very strange images which were very compelling and mysterious at the same time, that I could see that the youth, they accepted that. They thought it was perfectly fine. And I thought, what a wonderful idea if you could just do a poem that way, with some visual images that don't necessarily match the poem, but why not give them this experience? It's about the same length of time, 2-3 minutes. I thought you could easily convince people that poetry was cool if you did that.
And what about the connection with jazz now? How do you see that working?
Well, that's actually a very personal connection on one hand, because I think that a lot of my sense of the rhythms of our everyday life, our language, and then consequently in my poetry comes from jazz rather than, like, say, a standard ballad. I think we speak a syncopated English as opposed to Shakespeare's Elizabethan, rather measured English. But I also think that when you combine two art forms and let someone experience them simultaneously, so to speak, some of that anxiety is broken down too, because they begin to relate the art forms artistically as opposed to rationally.
Tell us about your childhood growing up in Akron, Ohio, and when you first discovered that there was poetry in this world.
Well, the neighborhood I grew up in was a intact neighborhood. There were older people on the street who watched you when you went to school and made sure you did what you were supposed to do. Lots of kids. And I grew up in a household that valued books, that loved, books. There were books in the house. And I was encouraged to read anything I wanted to. I think the philosophy was that if it was too old for me or too stupid, that I would get bored quickly. And I think for the most part that did work out. So I was just encouraged to read, and reading was the place I could go and be anywhere in the world at the drop of a hat. I think writing poetry began with that love of books, and then also imitating those books, you know, out of admiration.
When's the first time you ever wrote a poem? Can you remember that?
I believe it was in 4th grade. Yes, it was in 4th grade, and it was an Easter poem, and I wrote it in class. We had to write a story or a poem. Everybody groaned, of course. I was very happy, and so I started to write this poem about an Easter bunny with one droopy ear, and I was thrilled with it because I didn't know how it was going to end when I started it. And as I wrote, I got more and more into the story, and the ending came. And that was the first time that I felt that poetry, writing poetry, could also make you learn something that you didn't know before. That was the excitement in that.
And in college, you started showing your poems.
Yes. It was odd because I went into college thinking I was going to be a lawyer. And where I got this idea from, no one in my family said you should be a lawyer. I think I just got it out of the air. You know, there were certain things, if you were good at school, that you would do to show that you were intelligent, and that was to be a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. And I took my first government class and knew that this wasn't for me. It was impossible. So I stayed in English as a major so I could say that I was in pre-law, and took English classes and took more English classes, and then realized that I was arranging my whole life around my English classes, my creative writing classes. So that I must have been about a junior, 20 years old or so, when I went home and said, I want to be a poet, which must have been quite a shock. But to my parents' credit, they didn't blink. They didn't flinch. They said, fine, if that's what you want to be.
They didn't say, how are you going to support yourself? How will you earn a living? Don't you want a family?
No, none of that. I imagine that, I mean, my mother said they did have some worrisome moments, and they thought, what's going to happen to her? But, and you know, I imagine they probably thought, well, maybe it'll all wear away. But I never got any sense of that from them. My father had said that, well, he said, I don't understand poetry. Don't be upset if I don't read it. And I took that simply as a, you know, a very honest appraisal. I didn't feel that it was, you know, it didn't upset me at all. In fact, I thought, great, this is a go-ahead. I can go with that.
What does he do?
My father is retired now, but he was a research chemist for Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. And as such, he was the first black research chemist, or chemist actually, first person to get a white-collar job at Goodyear, which was stationed in Akron. Yeah, it's Akron.
Did your mom work outside the home, as they used to say?
As they used to say. No, she didn't. She worked inside the home.
But she valued education, too.
Absolutely, yes. She had graduated from high school when she was 16. She skipped a couple of years. And she told me later she regretted that her parents had her skip because she always felt out of sync with her class. She was always too young. But she read and read to us and encouraged learning. So.
And it was the story of her parents' lives that ended up as Rita Dove poetry. Thomas and Beulah, 1987 Pulitzer Prize.
Right, right.
Were those stories you just heard all your life growing up?
Some of them I heard all my life. Some of them my mother told me later, because my mother had an instrumental part in the book. When I began writing the poems, I called her and said, I'm writing some poems about Granddad. At that point, it started off with the grandfather's side of the story. And she talked to me. She goes, well, what do you want to know? Again, this trust was there, because she never asked to see a poem. You know, she never said, well, what are you going to do with that bit of information? We just simply talked. And I didn't know what I wanted to know, but we ended up having wonderful talks about her childhood and her parents and things like that. So it was a combination of a lot of things.
Yeah. Thomas was really something. I can just imagine him as a young man. Can you do it from memory, your description of him? And
he was a small and dapper man, and very, he had a twinkle in his eye. He had a twinkle. There's some people who do. Yeah.
But I love what you wrote. He was the king of the crawfish in his yellow scarf.
Yes.
Can you do it, or could you want to read it to us?
Yes, there's a portion in the Thomas and Beulah where, yes, he's playing his mandolin, king of the crawfish in his yellow scarf, mandolin belly pressed tight to his houndstooth vest. Yeah.
Who could resist him? What woman could
Absolutely.
resist him? So you write really the circumstances of their lives, how they met, how they fell in love, how they lived together.
Yes, all of those quote-unquote ordinary moments in life, no earth-shaking pronouncements, nothing that affected the course of history. And yet I think that all of us, that's how we live our lives, through our quiet moments, and history happens around us, and sometimes it impinges on us, but it's the very personal and tiny detail that we remember. So I decided fairly early on in writing it that I wanted to have two sides, that Thomas's story would happen first, and he would tell his story in short poems, and then Beulah would have her side. She gets the last word, too. So.
There's a character, anyway, a prop that crops up in the course of the writing that intrigues me very much. It's it's their 1909, was it? Copy of the Werner Encyclopedia.
The Werner Encyclopedia, right.
And read to us a little how you introduce it in a poem called One Volume Missing.
Yes, in this poem, One Volume Missing, it tells how Thomas finds the encyclopedia. He's at a rummage sale, and the encyclopedia is there on sale because one volume is missing from it. So, and he buys it, and the end of the poem goes, Werner's Encyclopedia, Akron, Ohio, 1909, complete in 25 volumes, -1, for $5, no zebras, no Virginia, no wars.
You're an African-American poet, but you're not a black poet in the movement kinds of ways, are you? A political poet. Or do you feel you are?
Well, you know, I think that all poetry is political. What it needs to do is find its audience, or the one who, because poetry fires the soul, and that can easily turn into something political. But I think you're right in your assessment that I'm not generally considered to be a black poet in the sense of movement. I mean, I don't believe that an artist is really, in the end, responsible to any kinds of movements. They are responsible to what they perceive as the truth about a moment or whatever they are training their sight on. And then, if one is simply truthful to the situation as you see it, you can't help but be political in a way. I just think that there are times when, obviously, my experiences as a woman, as an African American, impinge upon my perceptions of the world and come out in the poems as well. There are also moments when I'm not thinking about being a woman, when I'm not thinking about being a black, where I'm thinking more about being maybe a mother, let's say, or just trying to get some sleep. I mean, no one walks around thinking all day long, gee, I'm black, or gosh, you know, I'm you know, Asian American. We don't think like that. We move through life through details.
Your first poetry reading here at the library was in the Great Hall. Tell us about that. How was that for you?
It was phenomenal. To me, you know, the Great Hall, this is the greatest library in the world, and this was the Great Hall of the greatest library in the world. And to actually give a reading in the Great Hall was a daunting prospect, an exhilarating one and a daunting one. And I thought to prepare, you know, for it, I did carefully plan out my reading. I wanted to give the audience a sense of my growth as a poet, so I did read pretty much through the spectrum. But to actually stand there in the Great Hall that night and to look up to the dome, for a moment I thought I was going to lose it, and then I thought, no, we're in this together. There's a community of ideas and spirits that this represents. And this poem is dedicated to all the women who, in Paris, who know how to stand up under the pressure of a gaze. Paris is a place where the municipal sport seems to be watching other people, and it's not considered impolite. It's just a matter of seeing who can strut their stuff the best. And the women from the islands from Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion are, I think, the champions. The island women of Paris skim from curb to curb like regatta, from Pont-Neuf to the Quai de la Rappe in cool negotiation with traffic, each a country to herself transposed to this city by a fluke called imperial courtesy. The island women glide past, held aloft by a wire running straight to heaven. Who can ignore their ornamental bearing, turbans haughty as parrots, or deft braids carved into airy cages transfixed on their manifest brows? The island women move through Paris as if they had just finished inventing their destinations. It's better not to get in their way, and better not look an island woman in the eye unless you like feeling unnecessary. Thank you all. Thank you. I guess I'm going to